Hello, everyone. Today with us, we have Andre Abassi, who is a 3L at UC Law at San Francisco. He currently serves as the co-president of the student chapter of the Animal Legal Defense Fund in San Francisco and is working on a campaign to increase legal protections for invertebrates at the federal and state levels, having founded the Society for the Protection of Insects. Today, our interview will help us understand the problem of insect suffering and also look at the aim of Andre's organization. So firstly, to understand the problem, what are the main sources of insect suffering in the world? Insect farming looks like it could be, but I'm sure there are also plenty in the wild as well, perhaps the spread of pathogens. Do you have anything here to add?
Yeah, I mean, you've definitely very briefly captured the overarching sources. So if we're looking at sheer numbers, there is a subset that is of insects that are suffering as a result of agricultural practices, the use of pesticides. There's a growing subset, unfortunately, in insect farming, which is producing insects for the protein in their bodies, among other things. Um, and and then we have the spread of pathogens from one insect to another or from just in the wild. We have things like direct predation. If you're thinking about wild insect suffering, there's predation is a big aspect. Probably not in net given just the sheer mass of insects that are being harmed in other ways. Insect predation is probably not what is causing them the most amount of suffering, just by the numbers and maybe even by the intensity, um, and the speed of the deaths. But that's still kind of hasn't been strongly established yet. But yes, so predation, climate change, based habitat loss, and habitat altering from development, to a lesser degree. Those are probably the largest few, I guess, general categories, if you were to look at it that way.
Yeah. And how would you compare insect welfare with other cause areas like hen welfare or fish welfare? Are they just as important or more tractable in that it's easier to get change in insect welfare than it is in other areas?
So answering your first, I guess the first part of that about importance, I think if you're adopting an ethical or philosophical framework that is valuing an individual equally to any other individual, and you are, under under the assumption that everybody's equal, everybody deserves equal moral consideration, um, then you could certainly say that just the sheer number of insects on the planet and invertebrates on the planet, especially if you're zooming all the way out to invertebrates and including shrimp and other kinds of shrimp-like crustaceans, the numbers outweigh pretty much all other animals being harmed basically in any sort of way. So as far as importance by the individual, there's a great deal of suffering that an individual, unique being is feeling. I know some people come up with, especially your, consequentialist utilitarian people who really like math and they like to value individual because, there's some argument that maybe they feel pain less acutely or something like pain less acutely to us, and maybe individual life is worth somewhat less than a mammal. I disagree with that. I think it might even make sense for them to feel pain more acutely than we do, um, given evolutionary needs, just to survive, and the need to be able to quickly react and get away from um, predation. So, but even if you the estimates I've looked at, even if you're kind of granting them less worth and less value, the sheer numbers, which again are in the trillions, they're still very important, just as important in my view as any other being that's suffering. And separately, I think, kind of broadly speaking, the way I see humanity going and the way I hope humanity going is if we're going to be treating animals and other beings with some baseline level of respect, it really is going to start with the way we treat those who are the most powerless, the most defenseless, the smallest, and maybe even the least like us. That's going to set the baseline for how we treat others. Um, so it has that sort of, I guess, maybe symbolic importance as well. Whereas if we're treating even the smallest among us, you know, if we're cupping insects in our house, if we're cupping a spider and taking that spider outside rather than squishing, you know, the poor being, or if we're willing to grant this kind of consideration to someone so small, then it makes me really hopeful for what we can do for all beings and all life on Earth, um, especially for other humans. So feasibility wise, I think the movement is starting to look more at invertebrates. They're starting to recognize that the numbers combined with the capacity to feel um, make a hell of a strong argument. Um, and that's not even looking at just the environmental effects that exist from dealing with these animals and the way that we deal with them, and the threat to other life forms, the threat to human life, which ultimately can have economic impacts too. But so people are starting to recognize it, and I think one thing that makes it better, one thing that makes it more valuable, is that it can sort of be a test project because for other animals as well, because people already have more exposure to insects, I think, than they do other your average urban person. They never interact with a leopard or you know, maybe a chicken. They're not in their data. They're not going to find a chicken in their house, right? Like a chicken's not going to be in their house typically, your typical person, but there will be different types of, you know, different types of bugs in their houses here and there that everyone's going to interact with them. Everyone has some level of baseline. So you'll see that people already sort of treat insects with a level of implicit respect that maybe they don't with some other animals. It's instinctive for a lot of people to take an insect out of their house, right? It's instinctive. Um, and there isn't the cognitive dissonance either. I don't know if you've thought about this ever, but most people are not directly consuming insects, right? We're not eating insects. So it doesn't hurt somebody to think about, well, how can we treat these guys better if it's not conflicting, you know, because it's not conflicting with their diets. They don't have to think, oh, but this is my food. Oh, but this is my culture. We eat this animal. We have to eat this animal. Instead, there's like, oh, well, this isn't my food, right? I don't eat this guy. So yeah, we could treat them better. And there's been I was looking at a psychology paper came out recently. It said that the way when you treat somebody better, right? Um, you're more likely to like them and advocate for them just based on your treatment. And we're already treating insects in our house like better in our day-to-day life than we're kind of directly treating other animals. So I think for those reasons, there's a lot of feasibility. We're already treating them better. We already don't have that cognitive dissonance where we're eating them in mass numbers. Generally, most people aren't eating them at all. So, and people have that respect. And it doesn't really, and I guess a big piece of it is economically, there aren't billions and tens of billions of dollars of just financial weight behind these industries. So going up against lobbying, we don't have to deal with a whole bunch of, you know, massive amounts of money from venture capitalist firms. Obviously, there's some money now, but I think it could sort of be a blueprint for the way we start to treat other animals.
Yeah, and one thing that I found very interesting is this whole discussion on the pain that insects feel and how they might feel it less than other beings. Um, so you said that you know, insects evolutionarily probably feel a lot of pain. But I think another thing to add here is also insects are much smaller, and so even though pain might be like lesser on our scale, it probably still is a lot for that insect itself. And I think that leads me into asking whether you believe that like insects' lives are net negative, because the argument that's often made is most insects live short lives, and that means that they're mostly made up of pain that they've had to endure during the process of death. They've not had enough positive experiences to make up for the negative experience at the end of their life. So I wanted to know like what you thought about this view that some people hold of insects.
That their lives are probably mostly not
Yeah,
positive. Is that the Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say, right? It's always going to be tough until we establish a way to communicate with them in a way that we can ask them these questions. It's hard to say what brings joy, right? We know we can see states like optimism, we can see states like pessimism, we see states like play among these insects, and we would assume, anthropomorphizing them, that when they're playing, they're having fun the same way that we have fun when we're playing, right? And I think it's probably fair to assume that they enjoyed it or they wouldn't keep doing it because it doesn't really do much for them. Or your species of insects that are kind of gregarious and like to be among other insects, they probably feel better being in large groups of insects than when they don't. Another thing, I think another factor worth considering is there is research that is suggesting at least that their perception of time is different than our perception of time, right? So even if our lives are short, it may feel much longer to them than it looks to us, or our experience of their lives. So if you combine kind of the slowed down time, or maybe the lengthening of their lifespan from a subjective perspective, with the things that they do, I mean, who knows how a fruit fly feels when a fruit fly is flying towards a food source? We would assume good, the same way that we would feel as we're entering a restaurant that we like, right? um so I think it's very hard to say. I don't necessarily buy into the argument that their lives are completely a net negative, although I can understand, the aspects of it. I think regardless, we probably have a moral imperative to at least limit the negative impact that we're causing on their lives, to the extent that it's unnecessary. And if it does turn out to be the case where they're just horrible, horrible lives, which I think would be kind of strange if that were the case, but if it is the case that they just have these very horrible lives, then maybe doing whatever we can to kind of ease that and that suffering, to the extent that we can, I think would be probably something that we should be doing, and something that we should see as the next maybe major hurdle that we do on this planet, especially to undo a lot of the increasing kind of just the crescendo of suffering that we've caused in the past 10,000 years, where this is by far the worst time ever in human history to be any kind of creature other than a human. It's never been worse for the animals ever. So maybe trying to unpack and undo some of that damage. And if they're already suffering to begin with in the wild, then at least, yeah, reducing that, and working towards that goal.
yeah, absolutely. I agree with your take as well. So I don't think we can definitely say that they're net negative. I guess there's maybe a chance that they are, but in general, my understanding of these whole arguments about like how some beings' lives are net negative don't really hold true, because if they were net negative, then I'm assuming that that would impair their ability to live and actually like, procreate, or find food or be motivated to do things. So I think in general it's a harder thing for people to prove, but I understand where some people are coming from. But I think what this whole thing really makes me feel is, because insects don't necessarily live net positive lives, and they might live at best net neutral lives or slightly net negative lives. It's more important to help insects, because being able to reduce the suffering of an insect can change the insect's life from net negative to net positive. And so the marginal value of actually helping an insect is much greater than helping, let's say, other animals that might be living slightly more net positive lives. This is an interesting take that I have, because a lot of people disagreed, and they said that they might want to help like a cow on a farm, on a dairy farm, that's probably living a net positive life, even though it is a bad life, um, because they think that helping a cow might mean that they're reducing more suffering, because cows can feel pain more greatly than insects can. But even on the scale of like an insect, I think that because insects live net negative lives, it's more important to help insects, if we have the same capacity to reduce suffering. So if they can reduce, I don't know, 50 units of suffering should be able to also reduce 50 units of suffering for insects. So I think that might be like a reason why I think insect suffering is important and why like I'm very scared of insect farming.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think just the numbers of insects makes such a strong argument. It's the
Yeah, yeah,
feasibility.
yeah.
It would be so much easier too, right? Like it's just there isn't the money. The money's not there. The industry isn't super established. The industries aren't super established, and there's not there's people working towards it, and there's not a lot of people working against it, if that makes sense. So it can be done so much easier with so much less resources, and so much less kind of human capital that is invested against it, basically, that if you consider the numbers you can help and the amount of work it would take to help those numbers, there's just it's a no-brainer. There's no reason not to do it. And if they're living net negative lives, or even if they're not, regardless, the amount of, I guess, units of suffering you can impact is so massive, with such a small amount of work. And we say this in our meetings, really, to try to remind people is that, look, any little bit that we do just statistically is going to have a very large impact on the individuals, like to the individual who's suffering, the individual bumblebee, the individual fruit fly. They're going to feel like ultimately that makes a big difference in the net. So that's what I try to focus on, is thinking about the individual.
Yeah. And I have a few questions on law and insect welfare. My first question is insect farming even legal? In the US, can I farm just about anything and sell it for human consumption, or is there like a process that I have to go through? Maybe the FDA, I'm not sure.
Yeah, for human consumption, your food has to be generally recognized as safe, with the Food and Drug Administration. And there's Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. There's a few hurdles you have to get over, unfortunately, or however you want to see it. I would say, unfortunately, that is already underway. Some insects are already considered generally recognized as safe under U.S. law for human consumption. Um, there are, like any other industry, there's environmental hurdles you have to get through, but those hurdles have been jumped through. They exist, but they are, it I guess, in short, yes, insect farming is legal in the US. It is legal. It's less regulated in this country than in some European countries. So what we're seeing now is there are certain companies that are shifting their operations, to the US, because we have somewhat of a more friendly, regulatory scheme for this type of industry. And what we're further seeing is that there are municipal, county, states, and even federal, sources of grants, and tax breaks, and just cooperation for these industries that's making it easier for them to operate, with less, uh, without naming any particular companies or any particular places, that are making it easier for them to get established and to run. So it's very much legal, in certain senses, but there are other things that are happening that are not legal, in my view. That there is a push now, um, for enforcement, so that these industries don't get off the ground and they don't get entrenched, um, and don't cause all the damage that they're going to cause to wild animals, to wild insects, to insects in captivity, and ultimately, to our economy, especially at the expense of our tax dollars, at the expense of our environment, at the expense of our public health. So there is a push for enforcing the aspects of insect farming that I think are, in the best case scenario, bordering on maybe being legal, but are, in a worst case scenario, egregiously, in violation of federal law and state law. And those aspects are some of the things that we are working towards at the Society for Protection for Insects.
Yeah, and would you consider these as like legal tools to slow down insect farming? To what extent do you think they might actually work?
Well, I'll say this: some of the environmental, and even kind of consumer based, regulations and statutes that we have in this country, um, are extremely strong. They're not just some of the strongest in the world, but they are some of the strongest, like teeth, for lack of a better word. They're some of the strongest teeth we have in our entire legal system. One of um, one of my law professors last year, when he was talking about the Endangered Species Act, he referred to it as the most radical piece of legislation that the United States government has ever passed. And the Endangered Species Act is, in some ways, the least speciesist law that we have in this country, in some ways, because it doesn't matter whether you're a worm or a fly or a gorilla, right? They're all endangered species are treated equally under this law. So so and the Endangered Species Act specifically, for example, has an extreme amount of discretion in a lot of different ways and a lot of enforceability provisions. So even with something like standing, it's much easier to get standing in an endangered species, even than compared to other environmental law like statutes like the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. The Endangered Species Act says anyone can bring suit because everybody's affected by the environment. Even so, for example, if you live in Alaska, you could theoretically bring suit in Florida, across the country, thousands of miles away. This is something that is sort of unique. It's rare, and it's good news if you are concerned about endangered species of insects and how they might be affected by massive industrial scaling of insect farming that is bound to produce pathogens, that is bound to affect their environments. And it seems that, I don't know if you can hear him, but my cat agrees on that point as well.
Oh God. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the cat. Yeah. We always like having guests on the show. Um, so yeah, you mentioned how insect farming can lead to the spread of pathogens and can also harm the environment. Is there an anthropocentric way to frame insect welfare?
Yeah. I think there's a couple anthropocentric ways to frame insect welfare, and it's really a spectrum of we're getting further and further away from maybe the heart of, I think, the ethical issue. But at one end you have, within the anthropocentric lens, at one end you have, um hey, we enjoy seeing these wild insects. Everybody has a fond memory as a child, seeing fireflies, or lightning bugs as they call them in some parts of the country, flying around, or a kid watching a caterpillar crawl up a little plant, um seeing butterflies, seeing bumble. There's a lot of charismatic species that people want to protect just because of their intrinsic beauty and the beauty that people see and enjoy from them. So that's one aspect. If you're dealing with pathogen spillover and the effects that insect farming will have towards these insects, I think another one is just the inherent respect people tend to have for insects, that they feel like people want to support the natural world, have respect for all life, and it makes them feel good to do that. As you start to slide in that scale more towards the really, really just human centric views, you get things like, what if the next pandemic comes out of this, right? And there maybe, right? Let's not forget that the bubonic plague was spread, yes, by rats, but really by fleas, right? Really by fleas, who are insects. And so if you are putting fleas into an environment where they're more likely to have pathogens proliferating, mutating, and spreading, and potentially leaking, then you're ultimately creating an environment where humans could be adversely affected very directly. That public health argument. If you're dealing with pesticides, you can talk about just the collapse of an ecological pyramid that can happen with the mass extinction that is currently happening with wild insects and the effects that can have on our food system. And that's also a very kind of, this is why we want to treat them well. Maybe don't use these pesticides. Maybe don't do this in a certain way, because when they all die, other things happen that ultimately affect us as well. Another argument I think that you can make it if we're talking about animal testing, um, is if we're not regulating the way that we're testing these insects, especially people have kind of more of an awareness about this now, post-pandemic. Um, what are we ultimately causing, right? What are the long-term effects of treating lab subjects in a certain way, um, in a way that may not even be that effective towards like human medications and human kind of consumption. So thinking about, I guess, how can we rewire some of our systems for how we're treating these small, like the smallest kind of life forms in laboratory settings, right? Um, with the intent and the look that in the long-term view, we don't want to be really treating anyone who can suffer in a bad way. And I think about this a lot because I think that if you're, it's different kind of people have said things like this, but the mark of a human is really the mark of humanity is really going to be based on how we treat those who are the least powerful against us, those who have the least amount of ability, who are completely at our mercy, right? So if it's legal right now to basically torture a bumblebee in a laboratory setting with no loopholes, basically no actual regulatory oversight, no loopholes. We don't even know the numbers that we're putting them through, the numbers that we're like that we're treating, that we're testing on, that we're sticking things into their heads um, without any kind of anesthetic. We don't we don't even need to know the numbers because there's no law requiring it currently because they're not considered, for purposes of animal testing, they're not considered animals. Um, then we're losing a piece of our own humanity, right? And that's a different kind of, I guess, anthropocentric way of seeing it, and the way that we're going to treat others. And that is another thing that we think about too at the Society of Protection Forensics, that we're kind of trying to focus on ways to maybe expand a little bit the scale of, I guess, direct kind of welfarist implications that things like insects testing and animal testing laboratories would have.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'm worried about is whether people actually will extend their care and empathy towards insects. So growing up, I obviously really like cared about insects like butterflies. I was the type of person who was too scared to kill insects, so I would obviously like try to like have them escape um my house, like let them out. And these are like things that are obviously ways to reduce pain and suffering in insects in like everyday interactions. But I'm not really sure if like a lot of people can relate because a lot of people find insects to be pets, to be pests, and they treat them in quite bad ways. They probably also don't know whether they feel pain at all, and so that's a huge hurdle I think that needs to be overcome, which that we have to overcome because I think it's just very difficult for people to make that emotional connection to a lot of insects. And we see this in like the silkworm industry where silkworms might be even feeling pain, but it's just the sad fact that people just do not care enough to realize the pain that they go through. And so I really hope that we get to a world where we at least are able to prevent insect farming, because I think that that's something we can definitely do. And framing that in the anthropocentric way you described about how this could lead to environmental harm, how there could be a lot of harm to insects that are being farmed, how this could lead to like more disease being spread. I think that is a great way because to prevent it, because trillions of insects will be farmed if we do not do anything. And that's a huge number. And assuming that pain is felt on the individual level and the more number of beings feeling pain, the worse. I think insect farming obviously will be like a huge problem. So I think that's the thing. As for like what we can do for insects in the wild, I think it's more difficult to say whether they live net positive or net negative lives just yet, but we will obviously get to know more with research that's being done. But I guess that's my take. I just don't know if we'll be able to convince people that like insects matter, because we're already struggling to do that with like other animals. Even though they interact with insects more, I think the kinds of interactions they have with them are negative interactions where they often see them as things that they can, kill and crush. Whereas I'm assuming that at least with other animals, they feel a bit of sadness, that like a pig or a cow had to die for the meat and they distance themselves away from that. Maybe that's the way I see it. So I guess that's the thing. Really. And this brings me into the next section, which is like the aim of obviously the work that you're doing, which is what has to be done to secure legal protection for insects. So a lot of statutes that are out there for cruelty laws, as you said, like are about animals. So is the first thing obviously trying to get insects to be included under that like term. Like what does legal protection for insects even look like?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different ways. I mean, there's different avenues, right? Like there's animal cruelty laws where in some ways we're almost at an advantage because in some ways, because insects are for most states in the US are not included under those definitions. So it almost puts them into like a different category where there's different sort like there aren't agricultural exemptions that apply to farm animals, to insect animals, at least not in the letter of the law, right? There aren't certain like all the exemptions, even like the scientific exemptions, for example, that because they're just not included in like the actual exemptions under this definition of animal. So you could make a very wacky argument and say, well, because they're not animals, this exemption doesn't apply in a litigious setting if you're suing somebody over something. But there's other areas where I think looking at strategy long term, and I don't want to go too far back into what you said because I do just want to briefly touch upon it. Bringing awareness towards people, there's a couple of different ways to do it, and you do need some amount of awareness and you need buy-in. You need people to agree, right, to some degree that these animals deserve some amount of moral consideration and they should be protected under the law. To establish that, I think there's a couple areas where we have like strong kind of pre-existing hooks in society where people love bumblebees, right? We love bumblebees. They're our pollinators. 60% of Americans already believe something around 60. I don't remember these. It's about 60% already are under the impression that insects feel pain. I was not among them before I started doing this research, but I was still felt like, yeah, I should probably not squish this bug in my house. Um, so people kind of there's insects we like. There's a lot of campaigns that are successful about pollinators, about monarch butterflies, at least in California. People are thinking about them in a way that is positive. And if we're talking about farmed animals, I mean, bumblebees are farmed here. We are already farming them. Maybe not to eat them, but certainly to eat their excretions, that the food that they produce for their larvae, just honey. And also as working animals, kind of in the same class that oxen and horses and goats and donkeys have occupied, that will send them out into a field and then they go around and pollinate almonds and other plants. So there is that kind of working relationship where I think people do have some amount of, again, going back to the anthropocentric, they do have a valid interest in wanting them not to suffer, right? And there's already legislation that's being worked on, that has been worked on for banning certain pesticides that are affecting bees in a certain way. So it's not completely unheard of doing things like that. If we're going to get into like the more kind of hardcore insect farming welfare and insect welfare generally, there's a couple different ways, I think, several different ways that you can obviously approach a campaign like that. Legally speaking, impact litigation is a big thing in this country. We've seen all sorts of social justice movements use impact litigation successfully to bring awareness, to get landmark cases at the Supreme Court that establish precedent that just makes sweeping changes in the way that we treat different individuals. So to the extent that that could be replicated with insects, it will probably come through. I think, environmental statutes, most likely, or consumer protection laws. And people like consumer protection laws. People don't like consuming, things that are dangerous. People have more and more, given the effects of climate change, have more concern about the environment. So I think a mixed campaign of impact litigation, I'm talking lawsuits against either government agencies or possibly against companies themselves, with a public awareness campaign, with grassroots people coming together, deciding as a community what they want, what they don't want in their community, um, along with policy based push, is probably the way that I think this goes forward with national media. And there's enough kind of interest, I think, already in the different types of ways that animals and insects specifically might suffer, that I think we have a pretty strong roadmap ahead of us that we're already sort of implementing, to keep these insects protected, or to protect them more than they are currently being protected. And it's really those sort of three prongs, I guess, that underlay our strategy. Um, and again, there's public benefit with every single aspect of it. It's not it's literally it's complete. It's obviously it's a completely selfless thing, but it benefits the public, right? It's um again, there's environmental benefits, there's health benefits, there's public just environmental enjoyment benefit to it. There's the moral benefit that an individual feels when they know they're doing a good thing, and people tend to vote in a positive way when it comes to animal welfare. People are very likely to check a box in a when presented with it. It says yes or no. Should we protect X? I'm like, yeah, let's protect X. And it's easier to do when there's not billions and billions and billions of dollars against us. And so far with insects, it's not, the numbers aren't that high. What they're trying to do is obviously the big push is going to be for feed for cattle and pigs and chickens and fish. Um, but it's still in its nascency. There's not an ungodly amount of number of money behind that emerging industry. And public sentiment is still very much against the idea of eating insects as food. So if you can combine public sentiment the way it already is, where it's already sort of against this industry, right? There's already memes on the internet about it. We won't eat the bugs. I don't know if you've seen that stuff, but there's like memes people are making about it. With the fact that the industry is new, the fact that we have exposure to these animals already, the fact that it's trillions of beings, the fact that it wouldn't take that much for us to protect them, I think there's a pretty strong, optimistic, and very likely outcome in the next couple of years where we can make a massive impact and make a bigger impact on these insects than we have ever been able to make in for any animal in the past 10,000 years. I think if we're going to ban an industry, if we're going to ban a kind of exploitative industrial factory farming operation, the first domino to fall is going to be insect farming. This is we I think we can ban insect farming if that's what it's going to take before anything else, before any other kind of exploitative industry. This I think this is going to be the first domino to fall. It's going to be the easiest. It's going to be the most impactful. And I'm extremely optimistic. I think we're all extremely optimistic about what we can do, and what's very likely to happen.
Yeah, and to jump in, I think that one of the big things for people working in animal welfare is they think that it's really difficult to get people to actually care about insects or at all have this as something that they can push forward. But they have to understand that people saw fish the same way they see insects today. They thought that they didn't feel pain. They thought that they weren't sentient, and I'm not obviously fish do go through a lot of suffering, and they're still farmed on a very large scale, but at least there is among people today consensus that they should be treated better than they are treated. And I think we can see the same applying to insects, especially because we have the advantage of the industry not actually kicking off to the extent that it has for other places. But there's also been some success in other countries. So in the UK, for example, legal protection for crustaceans was secured. And so I am really hopeful that we will be able to see something like that for insects, at least in the US and also in the EU. And we will be able to prevent it from, basically becoming larger than it already is, because we're talking about trillions of insects here. My question now is, what does your timeline look like? And what would you say is the biggest challenge that you see yourself facing? Because we are obviously optimistic, but what would you consider something that we should be worried about?
Yeah, well, one thing about the UK that I just want to mention, thank you for mentioning that, is that happened under a conservative government, by the way. That wasn't under like a leftist government that they secured that protection, and it's not like a completely toothless protection. It's pretty cool. Maybe we could talk about that at a different point in time, but it's pretty cool what they've done out there. So our timeline, sorry to answer your question. Um, so what we're hoping for within the next year is to have a, a pretty important and beneficial suit kicked off. And I'm happy to talk about that suit once it has started. Which already just from the testing and the talking to people that we've talked to, for the people that whom it's affecting the most, people are behind it, and they're not animal rights folk. They're not extreme, oh, we got to save, you know, the worm. They're not like super hardcore people who are thinking about animal welfare or animal rights. They're regular folk, you know, regular kind of, church going, blue collar people, and it already seems like they're kind of on our side with that potential suit. So kicking that off in the next couple of months, from this point when we're filming, and then simultaneously starting this a PR campaign, which we're already producing a lot of content for, to get people aware of what's happening, because a lot of people have no idea what's happening or what's about to happen, and how we're going to go from 1 trillion to 1 to 2 trillion, and it's just going to go up to 3 to 4 to 5 trillion in a span of like 2-3 years. And when I say when I'm talking about what trillion is number of beings being killed, in just an unpleasant way and in a horrible way. Not that there's really any pleasant way to deliberately kill somebody, but so kicking off that campaign in the next couple of months, in a more concrete way with the suit and the public information and awareness aspect of it. In the next 2 years, we want to have a policy initiative in place where at least at the state level, we can have some kind of prohibition or regulation, or maybe even outright ban, because there's so many negative aspects of this industry. Having that initiative voted on and in the legislature just in place would be the next 2 to 3 year kind of goal. And then I think maybe a nationwide ban in the next 5 years would be what we're shooting for. And I think it's extremely doable. I think it's more doable than maybe even I think that those goals might even be too modest and maybe not ambitious enough. But that's what we're shooting for timeline wise. Sorry, you said timeline, and then what was the other thing you were asking? Biggest challenge, right?
Yeah.
So I think one thing is going to be that this is an emerging industry where investors are starting to invest. It's happening. We're seeing, and even just one facility, we're looking at between 250 million and 500 million dollars in capital going in for investment. The potential for expansion. The people who are planning on expanding this industry they have very ambitious goals. We're talking about 30 facilities, 50 facilities, feeding all the people on Earth with insects in the next couple of decades. So I guess fighting the potential for money that could be on that side is a big one. Some people might think that getting the public sentiment on our side, caring about these little bugs, might be tough. I don't think that's a challenge. I think we're closer with insects than we are with pigs or chickens or cows, actually, or fish. But to the extent that is a challenge, ensuring that you have a campaign that kind of adequately addresses in a creative and interesting way the individual kind of local valued cultural creatures that maybe are insects that can get people kind of riled up about the idea. I think those are the two kind of the things that we're facing. And then finally, it's just getting enough people on our team helping out, because we're a small group. We're not huge, but people, a lot of people are on board and agree with what we're doing. So to the extent that we can get human power to help out with all the little different pots that need to be filled to save trillions of lives, that's another little hurdle that we're already kind of overcoming. We've increased our membership by more than double, I guess, yeah, in the past 2 months. So
Yep,
yeah.
that sounds great. And I realize that you might need to go soon, so I just want to make this quick. Um, you talked about how it was the Conservative Party in the UK that actually helped in securing legal protection for crustaceans. Why do you think this might have been the case? Does animal welfare not have to do with partisan politics?
I don't think it does. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it does. There's definitely conservatives out there who have written about animal welfare from different points of view. I mean, from using I've seen religious type arguments going into it, and those tend to be kind of the values that you'll see on the right. Um, with the UK, I think a lot of it had to do with Brexit and kind of saying, well, hey, we can do this just as well as the EU did. We can pass this and whatever. And so there's maybe that competitive, maybe I don't know, nationalistic kind of strange look to it. But um, we have endangered species out here. We have endangered species of bugs. You only have in this country if that's the way you want to look at it. Being um, a steward for all beings. Taking care of your own. These are the family. If you can expand the idea of the family value to all be there's things on the right, I think that really resonate with people when it comes to animal rights. So I certainly don't think it's partisan. I think that people on both sides can 100% get behind it, and the only reason they haven't so far is just that there's lobbying and there's not a ton of awareness. But I see a really bright future where we can get everybody on board with this. Our experience, at least going out so far at the Society for Protection of Insects, is all sorts of people are on board with this, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum. It's a human thing. We humans at our base, we don't want to hurt others. We don't want to cause suffering. So for that alone and the scale of the suffering, I think this is where we're going to see the first domino to fall and kind of achieving that next level of, I guess, civilization, where we're really treating all beings with respect.
Yeah, and are there any other organizations that are also doing work on insects, or is this part of like work that PETA's probably doing, but it's not prioritizing as much?
There's a little, yeah, so they're kind of the whole ecosystem of the movement is starting to work towards this stuff. So I know Mercy for Animals is thinking about doing things, animal equality, talk to them a little bit about it. PETA's got a lot of articles on their website. If you just type like insect that they've worked on. Faunalytics has done some insect stuff. It is being talked about. Then shout out to the Insect Institute, shout out to the Insect Welfare Institute, I think, and something like, gotta remember, Megan. Let me see what the name of. Anyway, could look them up. Correct me later. But yeah, there's it's the animal kind of welfare movement is working towards it, and even kind of the environmental. There's the Xerces Society out there doing things for insects. There's the Center for Biodiversity has a lot of work they're doing for insects. It's on people's mind. It is very much, it's the zeitgeist. I think this is it right now. Is bugs and invertebrates.
Yep, that sounds
Fish Welfare
amazing.
Institute,
Oh yeah.
Aquatic Life. I mean, I could start naming that people are thinking about. Yeah, it's happening.
Yeah. Are there any questions? Do you have any thing on like anything we haven't yet covered? Any questions you wish you were asked?
I mean, there's always going to be other things we could probably talk about. But yeah, I mean, I guess what people can do to get involved, and I would say, you know, just think about the bugs. Don't squish them. Think about ways that systemic ways that we can help out. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out to us. We would love your help. Yeah, yeah, I'd be happy to talk again. Always great having these conversations with you. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And to just add, there's Brian Tomasic's essays on reducing suffering. Um, and he has a lot about insect suffering and how individual and everyday actions can be taken to do that. But also he talks a little bit more about insect welfare in general. I will also be sure to link that in the description. So thank you so much, Andre, for your time. I realize you are busy and you have something really important to get to, but it was a genuine joy and pleasure getting to talk.
Yeah, and shout out to you, Karthik, real quick. To anyone who hasn't looked at your Karthik Logic website, you have an article on insect welfare already. So if you haven't seen that, guys, please read it. He did a great job on that. So yeah, would be cool to check that out too. But yeah, thank you
Thank you
again.
so much.
Love to talk
Bye.
again.